I watched my daughter-in-law spit on my reflection in the hallway mirror, not realizing that the wrinkled witch she despised was the only person in the house who knew exactly how to make her disappear. The villa is a cathedral of glass and cold, white marble, a place designed more for the lens of a smartphone than the warmth of a human heart. It sits perched above the Pacific, humming with the constant sterile whir of high-end air conditioning and the silent, judgmental gaze of 24 security cameras. To my son, Julian, and his wife, Vanessa, this house is a brand identity. To me, it is a gilded cage where the bars are made of my own silence and the crushing weight of their ingratitude. I sat in the corner of the breakfast nook, my fingers tracing the deep, permanent grooves in my knuckles, the calloused legacy of 40 years spent under the scorching heat of Hollywood sound stages. I am 66 years old, and in the harsh, blue-tinted light of the morning, I felt every single one of those years. My skin is a map of 1,000 long nights, a topography of sacrifice that Julian and Vanessa find offensive. Mom, can you just move? Vanessa's voice sliced through the air like a dull razor. She didn't look at me. She was too busy checking her lighting in a ring light she'd set up on the kitchen island. My team is coming over to film the Day in the Life segment for the brand launch. You look like a gargoyle sitting there. Your skin is so wrinkled it's catching the glare from the marble. It's distracting. It's off-brand. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, a choking sorrow that comes from being treated like a blemish in a home I paid for. I was hard-working. I was self-sacrificing. I spent my life in the shadows of the industry, working until my fingers bled from stitching together foam latex prosthetics. Also, Julian could have the crypto empire that had eventually collapsed and sent him crawling back to me. I had bought this villa with my life savings to protect his future, only for him to allow Vanessa to treat me like a shameful secret. I was just finishing my tea, Vanessa, I said, my voice low and fragmented, expressing a hurt I couldn't quite mask. I haven't seen the sun yet today. Then go see it from the guest wing, she snapped, adjusting a strand of her surgically perfected hair. And use the back stairs. We have high net worth individuals coming for the evening gala. I can't have you wandering around looking like a witch. It ruins the aesthetic of eternal youth we're selling. People buy my skincare because they want to look like me, not like the alternative. She turned back to her camera, her face instantly morphing into a mask of fake, shimmering joy. "Hi, everyone. Welcome to my morning," she trilled, her voice dripping with an oily, materialistic charm. I stood up, my knees popping, a sound she met with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. I saw my reflection in the polished chrome of the refrigerator. I saw the gray hair, the lines around my eyes, the genetic failure she used as an insult. So this is how they repay me? I retreated toward the servants' corridor, the only place in this $10 million mausoleum that didn't feel like a movie set. As I walked, Julian passed me in the hall. He didn't look up from his tablet. He didn't offer a good morning. He just sidestepped me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been placed in his way. "Julian," I whispered. "Not now, Mom," he muttered. "Vanessa's stressed about the Moretti group coming tonight. Just stay in your room, okay? We'll have a server bring you a plate after the guests leave." I reached my wing, a small, cramped room at the end of the laundry corridor. On the floor lay a trash envelope, a small plastic sleeve Vanessa had slid under my door. Inside wasn't a note of love or a request for my company. It was a list of rules for the evening, typed in a cold corporate font. Rule 4. Under no circumstances is Elena to enter the grand ballroom. Rule 7. If a guest asks, Elena is the live-in housekeeper's mother, visiting from out of town. The sorrow in my throat turned into something else, something cold, viscous, and familiar. It was the feeling of a professional preparing for a role. They saw wrinkled skin. They saw a witch. They saw a woman whose quiet wisdom had been silenced by their delusions of power. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that the woman who could turn a 20-year-old ingenue into a 90-year-old grandmother with a few strips of silicone and a sponge had forgotten how to command a room? I reached under my bed and pulled out a heavy, battered aluminum case. The latches popped with a defiant snap. The smell hit me first. The sharp chemical bite of professional-grade SFX adhesives and the sweet, earthy scent of molding clay. And these were my tangible assets. Vanessa thought she was the master of the mask because she knew how to use a filter on an app. She had no idea that I was the woman who had spent 40 years teaching the world that the mask is the only truth that matters. I may be old, Vanessa, I whispered to the empty gray walls of my room, my voice losing its tremor and gaining a sharp, lethal edge. But I am not foolish. And tonight, you're going to learn that the witch you tried to hide is the only one who knows how to write the ending of this story. I looked at the rules one last time before dropping them into the trash. You've forgotten who built this empire. Tonight the cameras wouldn't be looking at Vanessa. They would be looking at the stranger I was about to create. The shiver of betrayal was gone. In its place was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a master artist about to deliver her final, jaw-dropping performance. Life isn't about the skin you're born with. It's about the skin you're brave enough to wear when the world tells you to disappear. And I was done disappearing. The door to my suite, a generous term for a converted storage room tucked behind the industrial-sized laundry machines, clicked shut with a metallic finality. Here, the opulent scent of Vanessa's $500 candles was replaced by the stinging chemical odor of bleach and the low, incessant thrum of the villa's heartbeat, the water heaters and the internet routers. It was the digestive tract of the house, and I was just another piece of waste they were trying to process out of sight. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot, my knees singing with a dull, arthritic fire. I reached out to touch the rules for the evening list Vanessa had slid under my door. The paper was heavy, expensive cardstock. Even her insults were high budget. Rule 4. Under no circumstances is Elena to enter the grand ballroom. I felt a hot, stinging prickle behind my eyelids, the beginning of that familiar, choking sorrow. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, not from age, though Vanessa would say otherwise, but from the sheer, vibrating weight of the memories they held. These hands had spent 40 years in the trenches of imagination. They were scarred by hot glue, stained permanently by pigments that no solvent could fully erase, and stiffened by the thousands of hours I'd spent hunched over molding tables. So this is how they repay me? My mind drifted back, unbidden, to 1996. Julian was 5. The studio had gone dark during a strike, and the checks had stopped coming. I remembered standing in a flickering fluorescent-lit clinic in a strip mall, the smell of rubbing alcohol making my stomach turn. I had sold my plasma twice a week for 3 months, just to make sure Julian didn't lose his spot in that prestigious preschool. I can still feel the cold bite of the needle, the rhythmic squeeze of the rubber ball in my hand, all so he could have the quality start I never had. I worked until I was a ghost. I remember the set of The Wasteland where I pulled 72 hours straight, in a cramped makeup trailer living on black coffee and adrenaline, just to ensure the lead actor's transformation was seamless. I did it so Julian could have the designer sneakers, the summer camps, and eventually the seed money for that crypto empire he'd been so proud of. And then came the crash. 3 years ago, Julian stood in my old apartment, his face pale and his hands trembling, much like mine were now. He had lost everything. Vanessa's lifestyle brand was hemorrhaging cash, and the creditors were circling. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even blink. I sold my house, my stocks, and my small collection of original movie props, items that were pieces of my soul, to buy this villa in cash. I put the deed in a trust, naming Julian and Vanessa as the beneficiaries to protect them. I thought I was building a nest for us all. I didn't realize I was building a tomb for myself. The moment the moving trucks arrived, the temperature in my relationship with Vanessa dropped 40 degrees. It started with suggestions about my wardrobe. Then it was concerns about my presence when her aesthetic friends came over. Finally, it was the move to the laundry wing. "You're old, Elena," Vanessa had said last month, her eyes as cold as the marble floors. "What do you even know about the modern world? You're a relic. Having you around is like having a before picture permanently haunting my afterlife. It's bad for the brand." Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think that because I stayed quiet, I didn't see the way Julian looked away when I entered a room? Did they think I didn't notice the trash envelope wasn't just a list of rules, but a roadmap for my eventual disappearance? Vanessa had already started looking at senior living options on her iPad, places with beige walls and scheduled activities where I could be forgotten in comfort. I looked at the aluminum SFX case under my bed. It was covered in a layer of dust from the laundry vents. I reached down and dragged it out. The weight of it was a comfort. It was the weight of a life's work. Vanessa saw a witch when she looked at me. She saw a genetically failed old woman whose skin was a liability. She had spent so much time staring at filtered screens that she had forgotten the most basic rule of the industry I helped build. The most convincing lie is the one that tells you exactly what you want to see. Recounting my sacrifices didn't make me feel weak. It made me feel dangerous. I had sold my blood for that boy. I had worked to exhaustion for this house. And now they were trying to treat me like a prop that had outlived its production. I opened the case. The scent of spirit gum and silicone wafted up, a heady, nostalgic perfume. I looked at the high-definition sculpting tools, the palettes of skin-safe pigments, the fine lace of the wigs. These weren't just tools. They were the components of a revolution, and the choking sorrow began to transmute. It shifted from the heavy, wet ache of hurt into the sharp, electric hum of a plan. The quiet wisdom I had practiced for 3 years, the nodding, the retreating, the silence, had been my own form of deep cover prep work. I knew their routines. I knew their fears. I knew Vanessa's desperate, hungry need for validation from anyone with a higher follower count or a larger bank balance. I took a deep breath, the air in the laundry room feeling suddenly charged. I wasn't just Elena Vance, the housekeeper's mother. I was a master of transformation. You've forgotten who built this empire, Vanessa, I thought, my fingers hovering over a jar of sculpting wax. And tonight, I'm going to remind you that the witch in the attic is the one who holds the keys to the kingdom. I reached for my mirror. It was time to start the first layer. The empathy stage was over. The turning point was about to begin, and it was going to be a masterpiece. I knelt on the cold linoleum floor of the laundry wing, the vibration of the heavy-duty dryer rattling through my shins. This was the turning point, the moment the narrative shifted from a tragedy of abandonment to a masterclass in tactical reversal. I reached beneath the frame of my narrow cot and dragged out the battered aluminum flight case. It was heavy, scarred with stickers from customs offices in Prague, London, and Tokyo, and coated in a fine layer of lint from the machines. To Vanessa, this case was likely just more hoarded junk from a woman who didn't know how to let go. To me, it was the hidden weapon. I popped the dual latches. The sound was a sharp, synchronized clack-clack that echoed like a hammer cocking in the silence of the room. As the lid swung open, the scent hit me, a heady professional bouquet of spirit gum, 99% isopropyl alcohol, and the slightly sweet, earthy musk of high-grade sculpting silicone. My heart, which had been heavy with the choking sorrow of a discarded mother, began to beat with the rhythmic cold precision of a mission commander. So this is how they repay me? I looked into the mirror I had propped up on a stack of detergent boxes. My voice, when I spoke to my reflection, was no longer low or fragmented. It was sharpening, gaining the edge of a scalpel. Did they really think I had become that senile? I whispered. Did they truly believe the woman who convinced the world that a 20-year-old was a 100-year-old monarch had forgotten how to manipulate the eye? My secret wasn't just the kit. It was the fact that I wasn't just a makeup artist. I was a pioneer of hyperrealism. I had spent 40 years in the black of the film industry, creating identities that were so seamless they could pass a TSA inspection. And while Julian and Vanessa were busy siphoning my pension to fund their lifestyle, they had neglected to check my private offshore accounts, the tangible assets I had set aside from my years as a consultant for high-level prosthetic camouflage. I reached into a hidden compartment in the case and pulled out a digital tablet. I bypassed the villa's smart network and logged into my private encrypted server. This was my intangible asset, the Lady Beatrice Moretti profile. Vanessa had been obsessed with the Moretti Group for months. She saw them as her exit strategy, the billionaire venture capitalists who would take her failing wellness brand global. Because she had spent hours curating mood boards and sending desperate cold emails to a ghost. What she didn't know, what she could never have guessed, was that I had created the Moretti persona 2 years ago as a safety net when I first felt the wind of their greed turning cold. I was the one who had been reviewing her proposals. I was the one who knew exactly which buttons to press to make her jump. I may be old, Vanessa, I said, my voice now clear-headed and sharp, but I am not foolish. I began the transformation. I didn't reach for the beauty palettes. I reached for the anatomy. I applied a thin, medical-grade barrier to my skin, then began the painstaking process of layering translucent silicone appliances over my jawline and brow. This wasn't about looking younger. It was about the spatial contrast of power. And Vanessa saw me as a witch because I was soft and aged. Lady Moretti would be a predator, sharp-angled, glacial, and terrifyingly wealthy. I used a fine-tipped airbrush to stipple micropigmentation into the silicone, broken capillaries that suggested a lifetime of expensive wine, a slight tan that spoke of winters in St. Bart's, and a clarity of skin that only seven-figure dermatologists could provide. Every stroke was a tactical strike. Every layer of paint was a defensive fortification. As I worked, I felt the quiet wisdom of my career flowing back into my fingers. I remembered the philosophy of the mask. People only see what they expect to see. Vanessa expected a billionaire savior. She expected a woman who looked down on the wrinkled and the weak. I would give her exactly what her greed demanded. I pulled a lace-front wig from its silk bag, a masterpiece of architectural silver-white hair, hand-punched and styled into a sharp, intimidating bob. I fitted the piercing glacial blue contact lenses over my tired brown eyes. Suddenly, the Elena they despised was gone. In the mirror stood a stranger, a woman who looked like she owned the Pacific Ocean and was currently considering draining it. You've forgotten who built this empire, I thought, looking at the door that separated my laundry cell from the marble cathedral. I had one more weapon to activate. I opened my laptop and triggered the backdoor I'd installed in the villa's security system. I synced the microphones in the grand ballroom to my tablet. I wanted to hear every word of their betrayal. I wanted the legal truth to be captured in high fidelity, and the turning point was complete. The old witch had vanished into the laboratory of her own genius, and in her place sat a goddess of retribution. I reached for the vintage Chanel suite I'd kept hidden in a vacuum-sealed bag, a relic of my own dignity from a time before I let them hollow me out. The gala was starting. I could hear the bass of the music thumping through the floorboards. Vanessa was up there preening, waiting for a miracle. She didn't realize the miracle was already in the house, and she was the one who had invited it in. I checked the time. 7:45 p.m. The clash was imminent. I took one last look at the Elena reflected in the discarded silicone scraps on the floor. My kindness was never a doormat, I whispered, the voice now a cold, commanding alto. It was the stage for your downfall. I stood up, my back straight, my movements fluid and authoritative. The witch was done hiding. The artist was ready for her final act. The door to my room didn't just open. It was shoved, the handle clicking against the wall with the sharp, impatient sound of someone who owned the air I breathed. I didn't turn around. I remained hunched over my small vanity, my back a curved landscape of hard-working decades, my fingers quickly pulling a silk cloth over the silicone appliances I had been detailing. In the spatial contrast of this house, my room was a cellar, but for Vanessa it was merely an inconvenience she had to walk past. "What is that smell?" Vanessa's voice arrived before she did, a high-pitched frequency of pure, materialistic irritation. She stepped into the room, her hand waving in front of her face, as if the scent of my life's work, the spirit gum, the thinning agents, the clay, was a personal assault. It's like a chemical leak in here, Elena. I told you. The vents in the laundry wing are connected to the guest bathrooms. If the Moretti group smells this old theater stench instead of the $400 candles I've placed out, I'm holding you personally responsible. She walked toward me, her heels clicking on the linoleum like a countdown. She looked at my desk, her eyes landing on a discarded sponge and a jar of setting powder, with the same revulsion one might reserve for a dead rodent. "Still playing with your monsters?" she sneered, her disrespectful gaze raking over my reflection in the mirror. "Honestly, it's pathetic. You're obsessed with a past that doesn't exist anymore. You're obsolete, Elena, just like those rubber masks and the grease paint. Nobody wants to see the seams. They want CGI. They want my eternal glow serum. Plus they want perfection, not a wrinkled witch who can't even afford her own health insurance without Julian's generosity." I felt the choking sorrow rise in my throat, a familiar, hot ache. This was the woman for whom I had sold my vintage props, pieces of cinematic history, to fund her first influencer retreat. This was the woman for whom I had stayed up until 3 a.m. sewing custom silk backdrops for her photo shoots while my own hands throbbed with carpal tunnel. "I was just organizing my things, Vanessa," I said, my voice low, slow, and fragmented, carefully playing the role of the broken mother she expected. "I didn't mean for the scent to travel." "It's not just the scent that travels, Elena. It's the energy," she snapped, leaning over me until I could smell the expensive, cold chemicals of her own perfume. "You're a genetic failure. Look at your skin. It's a roadmap of everything I'm trying to tell my followers to avoid. Having you in this house is like having a before picture that won't go away. Tonight, during the gala, you stay behind this door. If you even poke your head out to ask for a glass of water, I'll have Julian move you to the Sunset Vista facility by Monday. They have gray walls and scheduled naps. You'd fit right in with the rest of the gargoyles." She reached out and flicked a small prosthetic ear off my table. It skittered across the floor into the shadows. "And clean this up. It looks like a butcher shop in here. You're old. What do you even know about the brand we're building? Nothing. You're just a ghost in the laundry room." She slammed the door. The sound echoed in the small space, vibrating through the industrial pipes above my head. I sat in the silence, listening to the fading click-clack of her heels as she retreated toward the marble halls of the grand ballroom. "So this is how they repay me?" The fragmented hurt in my chest began to cool, hardening into something sharp and crystalline. I looked at the prosthetic ear on the floor. I looked at my hands. Did they really think I had become that senile? Slowly, I stood up. The exhausted mother was gone. The quiet wisdom remained, but it was now backed by a strategic intelligence that Vanessa couldn't possibly fathom. I walked to the door and turned the lock. My voice, when I spoke to the empty room, was no longer low. It was clear-headed and sharp. "I may be old, Vanessa," I whispered, the words vibrating with a lethal, firm energy. "But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire. You think the camera is your friend? You think the lens tells the truth? You're about to learn that the most dangerous person in a room full of cameras is the one who knows how to control the light." I reached for my airbrush. The caustic tongue of my daughter-in-law had given me exactly what I needed. a reason to stop mourning the son I lost and start protecting the woman I still was. She wanted a high net worth individual to validate her vanity. She wanted a billionaire to sign a check and save her failing brand. I would give her exactly what she wanted. I would give her a stranger in the mirror who would tear her world down with a single elegant smile. The pacing of my heart shifted. It was no longer a frantic thrum. It was a steady rhythmic march. I looked at the silver-white wig on its block. It looked regal. It looked powerful. It looked like the end of Vanessa's delusions of power. My kindness was never a doormat, I said, my voice gaining a decisive weight. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. Class is in session, Vanessa, and I'm the one who writes the script. I sat back down, the obsolete artist ready to perform her final masterpiece operation. The transformation was no longer about hiding. It was about the ultimate reveal. The turning point had arrived, and the clash was only a few hours away. I picked up my sculpting tool, my hand steady as a surgeon's, and began to carve the face of her destruction. The door hadn't just closed. It had been a seal on my past. As the echo of Vanessa's heels faded into the distance of the marble hallway, the air in my laundry wing cell shifted. The hum of the industrial dryer became a rhythmic war drum, and the sharp, antiseptic smell of my SFX chemicals became the scent of an impending storm. I sat back down at my small, cluttered vanity, my breath hitching as I looked at the silicone scraps on the floor. So this is how they repay me? The question didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a diagnosis. I looked at my hands, the hands that had stitched together the nightmares and dreams of an entire industry, and I felt the choking sorrow of the last 3 years finally harden into a cold, unbreakable diamond of strategic intelligence. I reached for my magnifying mirror, the cool white LED lights reflecting in my eyes, and I began the most important operation of my 40-year career. This was the turning point. This was the moment I stopped being the genetically failed mother-in-law and became the ghost in the machine. I began with the neck, the place where age is most honest. I applied a thin medical-grade adhesive to my skin, my fingers moving with the fluid mechanical grace of a master surgeon. I layered on the translucent silicone appliances I had sculpted over the last month in the dead of night. This wasn't the crude perfection of Vanessa's filters. This was the quality of authority. I used an alcohol-based palette to stipple micropigmentation into the artificial skin, broken capillaries that suggested a lifetime of expensive sun on a yacht in St. Bart's, and a honeyed tan that spoke of high-altitude winters in Gstaad. Did they really think I had become that senile? I thought, my hand steady as a rock, as I airbrushed the fine silver-blue veins onto the back of my prosthetic hands. Did they truly believe the woman who convinced the world that a 20-year-old was a century-old monarch had forgotten how to manipulate the human eye? My hidden weapon wasn't just the silicone. It was the legal truth and the digital architecture of this very house. 3 years ago, when I used my life savings to buy this villa, to save Julian from a debt collector's shadow, I didn't just sign the deed. I oversaw the installation of the smart home security network, and the lead technician was a former apprentice of mine from my days at the studio, a man who knew that a hidden asset is only useful if it remains invisible. He had installed a backdoor into the server at my request, a private channel that allowed me to view every camera and listen to every microphone in the grand ballroom without leaving a trace on the main interface. With a few rhythmic, clear-headed keystrokes on my weathered laptop, I synced the ballroom's high-fidelity microphones to a private cloud server. Every whisper, every boast, and every admission of Julian and Vanessa's betrayal would be recorded and time-stamped. "I may be old, Vanessa," I whispered, my voice now shifting into a controlled, commanding alto that resonated with the sharp tone of my new persona. "But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire." The spatial contrast was now complete. I stood up, the cramped tiles of the laundry room feeling suddenly small beneath my feet. I reached for the vintage midnight blue Chanel suit, a tangible asset I had kept vacuum-sealed in a trunk for 2 decades. It was a suit designed for a woman who didn't just walk into rooms. She owned the ground they were built on. Against the industrial pipes and the lint traps of my prison, I looked like a queen waiting for her coronation. The pacing of my heart had settled. The frantic thrum of the discarded mother was gone, replaced by the steady, heavy beat of an architect of justice. I checked my reflection one last time. Lady Beatrice Moretti looked back at me. Her jawline was sharp. Her brow was regal, and her eyes, shielded by glacial blue contact lenses, were terrifyingly clear. "You wanted a billionaire to save you, Vanessa," I said, my voice cold and firm. "You wanted someone who values eternal youth over the genetic failure of the past. I am going to give you exactly what you asked for, and then I am going to show you what happens when the mask finally slips." I moved toward the servants' exit, my gait fluid and authoritative. I didn't shuffle. I didn't hide. I walked with the firm, decisive voice of a woman who is reclaiming her territory. I slipped out into the cool night air, the scent of the Pacific Ocean rushing to meet me. My driver, a retired stunt coordinator who had jumped cars for me in the 90s, was waiting at the end of the long, winding driveway in a rented, obsidian black Rolls-Royce. And he didn't recognize me at first. He shouldn't have. I had spent 40 years making sure of it. "Ready for the premiere, Elena?" he asked as I stepped into the leather-scented luxury of the back seat. "It's Lady Moretti tonight, Frank," I replied, the European lilt of my new persona perfectly in place. "And the premiere is over. Tonight is the closing night, and I intend to make sure the audience never forgets the final act." As the car began its slow, majestic crawl back up the driveway toward the front gates of my own villa, I felt a sense of peace. The choking sorrow was gone, replaced by the clinical clarity of a master artist. Vanessa and Julian were up there, preening under the cold luxury of the chandeliers, waiting for a miracle. They didn't realize that the miracle was already in the driveway, and she was bringing a mirror they weren't prepared to look into. The lights of the grand ballroom began to shimmer through the trees, a fake and flickering star. I adjusted my diamonds, squared my shoulders, and prepared to enter the lion's den. The turning point was behind me. The clash was only a heartbeat away. The world will try to convince you that you are the sum of your wrinkles and the quietness of your voice. They will treat your quiet wisdom as a weakness and your age as an expiration date. But truth has a way of hiding in the textures. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice or the youngest face. It's the one who knows how to paint the reality Everyone else is too blind to see. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. The obsidian black Rolls-Royce didn't just roll up the driveway. It commanded the gravel to part. Through the tinted bulletproof glass, I watched the villa shimmer in the night like a hollow diamond. It was a masterpiece of cold luxury, every light positioned to eliminate shadows, every angle sharpened to satisfy an algorithm. From the outside, it was a dream of success. From the inside, where I had spent the last 3 years in the laundry wing, it was a factory of ingratitude. I adjusted the sleeves of my vintage Chanel suit. My hands, encased in hyper-realistic silicone gloves that mimicked the manicured elegance of a billionaire, didn't tremble. The pacing of my heart had smoothed into a steady, predatory rhythm. I was no longer the wrinkled witch or the genetic failure. I was the architect of deception, and I was about to walk into the very trap I had set with my own hands. As the car came to a silent halt before the grand entrance, I looked at the security cameras perched like vultures above the portico. Vanessa thought she controlled this house because she had the app on her phone. She didn't realize that in this digital cathedral, I was the one who knew where the hidden wires were buried. So this is how they repay me, I thought, watching Julian step out onto the porch, looking small and desperate in a tuxedo that cost more than my first 3 SFX kits. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that the woman who once designed the prosthetic identities for 3 different espionage thrillers couldn't bypass a standard consumer-grade security network? The turning point had been the moment I accessed the backdoor in the villa's server. While Vanessa was busy curating her day-in-the-life reels, I had been busy syncing the ballroom's high-fidelity microphones to my private encrypted cloud. Every boast, every lie, and every piece of evidence regarding their forgery was already being streamed to a secure legal server in Zurich. This wasn't just a party, it was a digital execution. The door was opened by my driver, Frank. He offered a gloved hand with a professional gravity that masked our 40-year friendship. "Lady Moretti," he said, his voice a low, theatrical rumble. I stepped out. The spatial contrast was jarring. The cool, salt-tinged Pacific air hit my face, but I felt nothing through the medical-grade barrier cream. I walked with a fluid, authoritative gait, my silver-white bob catching the moonlight. I wasn't just wearing a costume. I was inhabiting a hidden asset. I was Beatrice Moretti, a woman whose wealth was so ancient it didn't need to shout. It merely whispered, and the world bowed. Inside the grand ballroom was a sea of plastic faces and materialistic hunger. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax was suffocating. I saw Vanessa across the room, her eyes darting toward the door with a feverish, hungry intensity. She was looking for a savior. She was looking for a check. I caught my reflection in one of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, the same mirror Vanessa had spit on that morning. I didn't see a witch. I saw a goddess of retribution. My clear-headed, sharp tone was ready. The quiet wisdom of the mother had been replaced by the strategic intelligence of the artist. "I may be old, Vanessa," I whispered to myself, the European lilt of Beatrice Moretti finally settling into my vocal cords, "but I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire." The signature dialogue formula was locked and loaded. I saw her spot me. I saw the moment her delusions of power met the reality of a high net worth individual. She practically shoved a minor celebrity out of her path to reach me, her face contorting into a mask of sycophantic adoration. "Lady Moretti," she gushed, her voice a high-pitched trill of desperation. "I am Vanessa Vance. Welcome to our home. Everything you see here, the brand, the aesthetic, the vision, it's all my design." I looked at her through my glacial blue lenses, my expression one of practiced aristocratic boredom. "Is it, Mrs. Vance?" And I have always found that true visionaries don't need to explain their work. They simply let the quality speak for itself. I felt the microphones on my lapel vibrate almost imperceptibly as they caught her frantic breathing. The clash was beginning. The architect of deception had entered the ballroom, and the first brick was about to fall. Life lesson. We spend our lives teaching our children that the world is a stage, but we forget to tell them that the person who builds the sets always knows where the trapdoors are located. Loyalty isn't something you can buy with a trust fund or a luxury villa. It's the only currency that doesn't depreciate when the lights go out. You can hide the before picture in the basement all you want, but eventually the truth will demand a front row seat. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the blueprint for your exit. The music swelled, a hollow electronic beat that underscored the falseness of the room. I took a glass of champagne from a passing server, my silicone-wrapped fingers steady. I looked at Julian, who was trailing behind his wife like a ghost in a suit. "Shall we find a more private place to discuss the legal truth of your business, Mrs. Vance?" I asked, my voice as cold as the marble beneath our feet. "I find the air in this room a bit thick with unearned confidence." The game was afoot, and I was the only one who knew the ending of the script. The heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom didn't just open. They retreated, bowing to the sheer, gravitational pull of the woman I had become. As I stepped over the threshold, moving from the salt-chilled air of the Pacific into the climate-controlled cold luxury of the gala, I felt the atmosphere of the room shift. It was a physical sensation, a sudden drop in the ambient chatter, the collective indrawn breath of 300 people who worshipped at the altar of the balance sheet. I stood there for a heartbeat, a master artist surveying her final set. The ballroom was a shimmering lie of white orchids, crystal flutes, and influencers whose smiles were as manufactured as the organic glow serum Vanessa was launching. Every camera in the room, and there were dozens, turned toward me. I didn't flinch, for through the glacial blue contact lenses, the world looked sharp, blue, and remarkably clear. So this is how they repay me, I thought, spotting Vanessa across the floor. She was a flurry of fake silk and desperate energy, holding a glass of green juice as if it were a holy relic. She hadn't seen me yet. She was too busy lecturing a server about the placement of a tray. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that the woman who could orchestrate a 1,000-person battle scene on a soundstage couldn't handle a single room of sycophants? I adjusted the weight of my diamonds. The silicone on my jawline felt tight, a second skin that hummed with the quiet wisdom of 40 years in the industry. I wasn't Elena the wrinkled witch anymore. I was Lady Beatrice Moretti, the ghost Vanessa had been chasing through the digital ether. "I may be old, Vanessa," I whispered, the voice coming out as a rich, commanding alto with a faint, untraceable European lilt. But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire. The spatial contrast was jarring. This morning, I was a blemish to be hidden. Tonight, I was the sun around which Vanessa's entire universe was about to orbit. I saw her spot me. Her eyes didn't just widen. They flared with a materialistic hunger so naked it was almost pitiable. She practically shoved a local news anchor out of her path to reach me, her heels clicking a frantic rhythmic beat on the marble. "Lady Moretti," she gushed, her voice rising into that high, artificial trill she reserved for people she wanted to devour. "I am Vanessa Vance. Welcome, welcome to our home. And we are so incredibly honored to have you here for the launch of Vance Beauty." I looked at her through my piercing lenses, my expression one of practiced aristocratic boredom. I let the silence stretch. In the Dignity Rise formula, the silence is where the power settles. "Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice cold and firm, "I trust the Vance brand is more substantial than the invitation process. Your security was remarkably porous." Vanessa's face went through 3 shades of panic before settling on a submissive, oily grin. "Oh, we'll address that immediately, Lady Moretti. Please come to the VIP lounge. We have a private table set aside for the Moretti Group representatives. Julian, honey, come here." Julian appeared from the shadows of the bar, looking sweaty and out of place in a tuxedo that didn't quite fit his conscience. He didn't look at Lady Moretti's eyes. He looked at my jewelry, his gaze flickering with the same delusions of power that had led him to siphon my pension. "Julian Vance," he said, offering a hand that I pointedly ignored. I merely nodded, a slight, regal inclination of the silver-white bob. "I am here for one thing, Mr. Vance," I said, the strategic intelligence of my career sharpening every word. "I invest in distressed assets that have a soul. I was told your brand was built on family integrity. I find that intriguing." "Integrity is our middle name," Vanessa chirped, ushering me toward the center of the room, right toward the VIP table where I knew the hidden microphones were waiting. She was fawning now, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. "Everything we do is for the legacy. Family is our foundation." I sat in the velvet armchair, the tone and pacing of the room now completely under my control. I looked at the cameras. I knew that my backdoor link was active, that every word Vanessa was about to say was being streamed to a secure server. This was the hidden asset technique in motion. The legal truth of their betrayal was about to be documented in high fidelity. "Is that so?" I asked, leaning back and accepting a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. Because, in my experience, those who talk the most about foundation are often the ones trying to hide the cracks in the basement. Vanessa laughed, a sharp metallic sound. "Oh, you're so witty, Lady Moretti. But really, our foundation is rock solid. We've managed to secure our entire estate through very clever trusts. We're quite protected." I felt a choking sorrow for the son I had raised, seeing him nod along to her lies, but I pushed it down. The firm, decisive voice of the protagonist took over. "Cleverness can be a liability if it's not backed by character," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal frequency. "Shall we discuss the numbers, Vanessa? I hear your Eternal Glow line is looking for a $10 million infusion. I'd like to know exactly what kind of family values that $10 million would be supporting." As she leaned in, her eyes gleaming with greed, I saw the witch, they had discarded reflected in the crystal of her glass. She didn't recognize me. She didn't see the woman whose blood had paid for the marble she stood on. And she only saw a checkbook with a silver wig. The most dangerous thing you can do to an artist is to make them the villain in your story. We spend our lives observing, learning how the light hits a secret and how a shadow can hide a lie. When you treat your elders as obsolete, you forget that they are the ones who know where the traps are buried. My kindness was never a doormat, Vanessa. It was the blueprint for your exit. Let's talk then, Vanessa whispered, her voice oily with triumph. Let's talk about the future. Yes, I replied, a grim smile touching my silicone lips. Let's talk about exactly what you've done to secure it. The clash was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and as the music swelled, I knew the stranger in the mirror was about to tell a story that would bring this entire house of glass crashing down. The VIP lounge was an enclave of velvet and shadows, tucked away from the frantic pulse of the main ballroom. Here, the cold luxury was at its most concentrated. The air smelled of vintage Bollinger and Vanessa's synthetic, suffocating floral perfume. I sat in a high-backed wing chair, my vintage Chanel suit smooth against the fabric, while Vanessa leaned in so close I could see the microscopic cracks in her foundation, cracks her own eternal glow serum couldn't fix. Julian sat to her left, looking like a man drowning in shallow water. He kept checking his watch, his eyes darting toward the influencers outside the velvet rope. He was a shell, hollowed out by a greed he wasn't strong enough to carry. Lady Moretti, a woman of your stature understands that sentimentality is simply a tax on success, Vanessa whispered, her voice an oily trill of practiced sophistication. She thought she was speaking to a peer, a fellow predator who viewed the world as a series of assets to be stripped. She didn't know she was speaking to the wrinkled witch she had spat on 6 hours ago. I swirled the champagne in my glass, the glacial blue contact lenses giving me a view of her that was terrifyingly sharp. I find that business is always more efficient when the overhead of family is managed, I said, the European lilt of my persona as cold as a scalpel. Tell me, Mrs. Vance, your brand emphasizes lineage, yet this villa is registered to a private trust. How secure is your foundation, really? Vanessa's eyes sparkled with a materialistic fever. She believed she was securing a $10 million check, and in her delusions of power, and she felt the need to prove her ruthlessness to the woman she thought was her idol. It's more than secure, Vanessa chuckled, a sharp, metallic sound. It's a masterpiece of acquisition. We live here for free, Lady Moretti. Julian's mother, a sweet but utterly senile woman, was convinced to put the entire estate into a trust for his protection. She thinks she's a saint living in her little room, while we use the house's equity to float the brand. I felt a choking sorrow tighten in my chest, a physical ache that I had to push down beneath layers of silicone and professional discipline. So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at Julian. He didn't even flinch. He just nodded, a slight sycophantic smile playing on his lips. And if she objects? I asked, my voice clear-headed and sharp. She's a relic, Vanessa sneered, to her disrespectful arrogance finally unmasked. She's obsolete. Half the time I have to hide her in the laundry wing so she doesn't ruin the aesthetic of our meetings. She looks like a gargoyle, Lady Moretti, wrinkled, gray, and pathetic. I've already started the paperwork for a state-run facility. Once the Moretti investment clears, we'll move her out under the guise of specialized care. She won't even know what hit her. Did they really think I had become that senile? The thought roared in my mind, but Lady Moretti's face remained a mask of glacial indifference. And the funding for your initial launch, I prodded, leaning into the spatial contrast of our positions. The accounts showed a sudden influx of capital last quarter. Julian is quite the digital architect, Vanessa bragged, patting his hand. We managed to reallocate his mother's pension and a few of her private bonds. We found her old passwords in a shoebox. She's so tech illiterate she didn't even notice the withdrawals. We even had to help her sign a few waivers. A little spirit gum on a signature goes a long way with a woman whose eyes are failing. Julian finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of the soul I had spent 40 years trying to protect. It's about the future, Lady Moretti. She's already lived her life. It's our turn now. She's just taking up space in a house that belongs to the future of the Vance brand. You've forgotten who built this empire, I whispered, though I made sure the words didn't escape my lips. Under the table, my hand hovered over the digital recorder hidden in my clutch. Every word of their confession, every detail of the forgery and the theft, was being streamed in high fidelity to the secure server I had established. This was the intangible asset, the weapon of truth that would strip them of the very perfection they used to justify their cruelty. Your ruthlessness is illuminating, I said, standing up with a regal, intimidating grace. It seems the Vance brand is built on a very specific kind of beauty, one that requires the total erasure of the past. Exactly, Vanessa gushed, standing with me, her face alight with a parasitic joy. I knew you'd understand. We're ready to sign whenever you are. Oh, the signing will be unforgettable, Mrs. Vance, I replied, my voice gaining a decisive weight. I think it's time we join the rest of the guests for the final presentation. I have a feeling the truth of your brand is about to become very public. As I walked out of the VIP lounge, the tone and pacing of the night reached a crescendo. I was the stranger in the mirror, and the reflection I was about to show them wasn't the one they had spent their lives curating. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the laboratory where I had prepared their reckoning, and the premiere was just about to begin. The walk from the velvet-lined silence of the VIP lounge back into the cavernous roar of the grand ballroom felt like a march toward a high-altitude drop. Every step I took in my Chanel heels, the gait of a woman who had once navigated the treacherous catwalks of $100 million film set, vibrated with the weight of the strategic intelligence I had spent 3 years suppressing. The atmosphere was thick with cold luxury, the scent of 1,000 expensive lies drifting on the air. Vanessa walked beside me, her hand fluttering near my elbow, as if she were guiding a fragile porcelain doll toward a vault. Her face was illuminated by the flickering blue light of 100 smartphones. She was in her element, fueled by delusions of power and the intoxicating scent of a $10 million check. She didn't know that she wasn't guiding a benefactor. She was escorting the architect of her own destruction to the center of the stage. So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking out at the sea of shallow, shimmering faces. Influencers in gowns made of glass and silicone. Men in suits that cost more than my first decade of retirement. all of them vultures waiting for the Moretti endorsement to validate their vanity. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that I would sit in the laundry room and watch them dismantle my soul without ever checking the inventory of my own weapons? "Lady Moretti, if you'll just step up here," Vanessa trilled, her voice amplified by the wireless microphone clipped to her silk lapel. She gestured toward the minimalist glass dais in front of a 30-foot LED screen. I'd like to make the announcement. This is the moment Vance Beauty changes the world." The crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of materialistic hunger. I stood on the stage, the glacial blue contact lenses giving me a view of the world that was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. I saw Julian at the base of the stage, his eyes wide and sweating, looking like a man who had finally realized that the bridge he had burned was the only way back to safety. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vanessa's voice filled the room, dripping with an oily, practiced charm. "We are honored to have Lady Beatrice Moretti with us tonight. She has seen our vision. She has seen the foundation of integrity and family values that Vance Beauty stands on. And tonight, she is here to confirm a partnership that will define the future of eternal youth." I looked at her. I didn't smile. I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat too long, the tone and pacing shifting from the celebratory to the surgical. "Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice projecting with the firm, decisive weight of a woman who had commanded 500-person crews under the most grueling conditions. "You talk a great deal about foundation. You talk about the truth of beauty. But I find that in my world, truth is not something you apply with a sponge. It is something you reveal when the lights are at their harshest." I saw the first flicker of confusion in Vanessa's eyes, the realization that the script was drifting. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on," I thought, looking directly into the primary camera lens, the one that was streaming this gala to 2 million of her followers. "Lady Moretti," Vanessa whispered, her voice dropping the trill. "The announcement, the check?" "I have seen enough of your vision, Vanessa," I said, the European lilt of Beatrice Moretti now carrying a lethal, crystalline edge. "And I have decided that before I invest a single cent, the stakeholders should see the actual foundation of this house." I tapped the screen of the digital recorder in my palm. The hidden asset technique, the backdoor I had installed in the villa's server, responded with the speed of a strike. The 30-foot LED screen behind us didn't show the Vance Beauty logo. It flickered, then resolved into a high-fidelity video feed from the VIP lounge we had just exited. The audio, captured by the microphones I had hidden in the centerpieces, erupted through the ballroom's million-dollar sound system. Julian's mother, a sweet but utterly senile woman, was convinced to put the entire estate into a trust for his protection. She thinks she's a saint, while we use the house's equity to float the brand. The ballroom went deathly silent. The only sound was the clatter of a glass hitting the marble floor. On the screen, Vanessa's face, captured in a brutal close-up, laughed that sharp, metallic sound. "She looks like a gargoyle, Lady Moretti, wrinkled, gray, and pathetic. I've already started the paperwork for a state-run facility. She won't even know what hit her." The clash was no longer a metaphor. It was a massacre of reputation. I watched Vanessa's materialistic world shatter in real time. The influencers, the press, the investors, They weren't looking at her as a goddess anymore, and they were looking at a viper caught in a cage of her own words. "I may be old, Vanessa," I said, turning to her, the clear-headed, sharp tone of the protagonist finally rising above the wreckage. "But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire." Julian tried to scramble toward the stage, but the spatial contrast had already shifted. He was no longer the owner of the villa. He was a defendant in a room full of witnesses. "Turn it off," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking, her eternal glow mask dissolving into a messy human panic. "It's a lie. It's deep fake. Security." "The security belongs to the owner of the house, Vanessa," I said, my voice gaining a final, decisive weight. "And as the senile woman you so despise can tell you, the deed has never left her hands." I stood in the center of the gala of shadows, the stranger in the mirror, finally ready to perform the ultimate operation. The truth was out, the betrayal was documented, and the public reversal was complete. But I wasn't done. The audience was waiting for the face behind the mask, and I was about to give them a premiere they would never forget. The tragedy of the digital age is that we believe we can curate a soul as easily as we curate a feed. We think that by hiding the wrinkles and the relics, we can escape the weight of our own actions. But character is not a filter. It is the raw, unedited footage of our lives. When you treat the foundation of your success like a doormat, do not be surprised when the very walls you built to protect your vanity become the screen that broadcasts your shame. My kindness was the laboratory where I planned your exit, and tonight the world is watching the results. I reached for the edge of the silicone prosthetic at my jawline. The clash was reaching its end, and the unmasking was about to begin. The silence that followed the video broadcast wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, a sudden and total withdrawal of oxygen from the grand ballroom. 300 of the most influential people in the city stood like wax figures, their faces frozen in the flickering blue light of the 30-foot LED screen. The audio, the raw, unfiltered recording of Vanessa calling me a genetically failed relic, and Julian laughing about siphoning my pension, continued to echo off the cold marble walls like a recurring nightmare. Vanessa's face, usually a masterpiece of high-end filters and surgical precision, was now a jagged landscape of horror. Her mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping on a dry deck. Julian had backed away from the stage, his hands raised as if to ward off the very air, his eyes darting toward the exits. But there was no exit. The smart home system I had reclaimed had already locked the perimeter. This is a deep fake," Vanessa finally shrieked, her voice cracking into a jagged, desperate frequency. She turned to the crowd, her hands trembling so violently that her champagne glass shattered against the glass dais. "It's a hack. Lady Moretti, tell them. This is a joke." I didn't answer in the European lilt of Beatrice Moretti. I didn't move with the stiff aristocratic grace of the billionaire. I stood in the center of the stage, the pacing of the moment reaching its ultimate crescendo. The tone was no longer fragmented or hurt. It was firm, decisive, and lethal. "I find it interesting, Vanessa," I said, my true voice, the low resonant alto of Elena Vance, reverberating through the $1,000,000 sound system, "that you're asking for help from the very woman you just admitted to trying to defraud." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I saw the moment the first person recognized the timbre of my voice. I saw Julian's knees buckle. "I may be old, Vanessa," I said, the words cutting through her panic like a serrated blade, "but I am not foolish." I reached up to my jawline. With a slow, theatrical deliberation that I had learned on the sound stages of the greatest epics in cinema history, I gripped the edge of the medical-grade silicone. The crowd leaned in, a single pulsating entity of morbid curiosity. I peeled. The sound was a faint, wet hiss, the sound of a lie being dismantled, as the sharp, regal jawline of Beatrice Moretti came away in my hand. I revealed the wrinkled skin of the woman they had hidden in the laundry wing. I reached for the silver-white wig, pulling it back, to show my own graying hair, messy and damp with the sweat of the transformation. I plucked the glacial blue lenses from my eyes, revealing the steady brown gaze of a mother who had finally stopped mourning a ghost. "Mom?" Julian's voice was a pathetic, hollow whimper. I dropped the prosthetic face onto the glass dais. It landed with a dull, rubbery thud, the discarded mask of their greed. "You called me a witch this morning, Vanessa," I said, stepping to the edge of the stage. The spatial contrast was absolute. I was a woman in a vintage Chanel suit with the face of a relic, standing atop a $10 million empire of their vanity. You called me obsolete. You said the world didn't want to see the seams. But look at this room. Everyone is looking at the seams now. Vanessa collapsed. She didn't fall gracefully. She crumpled onto the marble, her silk gown billowing around her like a dying flower. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing the delusions of power she had worn as armor. The influencers she had courted were already turning their cameras away, or worse, pointing them at her to document the fall. "The Moretti Group doesn't exist, Vanessa," I continued, my voice gaining a final, decisive weight. "There is no $10 million check. There is no partnership. There is only the legal truth, the house you stand in, the brand you've built on theft, and the trust you tried to forge. It all belongs to the woman you tried to bury in the basement." Julian tried to step toward me, his face a mask of a too-late apology. "Mom, please. It was her idea. I was just trying to keep us afloat." "You've forgotten who built this empire, Julian," I said, looking down at the son I had sold my blood to raise. "I built it with the hands you mocked. I built it with the obsolete skills you thought were toys. And today, I am reclaiming the inventory." I signaled to the back of the room. The double doors opened, and two men in suits, not the theatrical security Vanessa had hired, but my private legal counsel and two officers from the Financial Crimes Division, stepped onto the marble. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on," I said, the closing moral line of my life's hardest chapter. "It was the laboratory where I planned your exit, and tonight, the premiere is over." As Vanessa was hoisted up by the officers, her makeup smeared with real tears of fury and shame, and Julian was led away in a silence that felt like the grave, I stood alone on the stage. The witch was no longer hiding. The wrinkled face in the mirror was finally, beautifully, the only one that mattered. We spend our lives teaching our children how to look, but we forget to teach them how to see. We believe that by layering ourselves in cold luxury and digital masks, we can hide the rot of a hollow heart. But truth is the ultimate SFX artist. It doesn't need silicone or grease paint to reveal the monster. It only needs a mirror and the courage of the person holding it. I took a deep breath, the air in the ballroom finally feeling clean. The clash was over. The consequence had begun. And for the first time in 66 years, and I wasn't making someone else look like a hero. I was simply being myself. The silence that followed my unmasking was not the peaceful quiet of a theater after the curtain falls. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a vacuum before an explosion. I stood on that minimalist glass dais, the discarded silicone remnants of Lady Moretti lying at my feet like the shed skin of a snake. The glacial blue contact lenses were out, and for the first time in 3 years, I looked at my son and his wife with eyes that weren't clouded by the mist of a mother's desperate hope. Vanessa was still on the floor. The eternal glow she had spent months marketing was nowhere to be found. Her face was a sallow, mottled mask of terror, her expensive foundation streaked with the salt of real, uncurated tears. She looked up at me, and in her eyes I didn't see remorse. I saw the frantic, flickering gears of a predator trying to find a new angle. "Elena, Mom," Julian stepped forward, his voice a thin, reedy thing that barely carried over the restless murmurs of the crowd. He reached out a hand, but he stopped 3 feet away, as if there were an invisible, electrified barrier between us. "We can fix this. It was a strategy. We were trying to build something for all of us. You know how the industry is. We had to look a certain way." "So this is how you repay me?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. It was firm, decisive, and carried the weight of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding sets where every second cost $10,000. "By treating the woman who gave you life like a genetic failure to be hidden in the laundry wing. By forging my name to steal the only security I had left." "It wasn't stealing," Vanessa shrieked from the floor, her voice cracking. She scrambled to her feet, her silk gown caught on the edge of the dais. "It was an investment. You weren't using the equity. You were just sitting on it like a witch on a hoard. We were going to give it back once the Moretti deal closed." "The Moretti deal," I said, a cold, sharp smile touching my lips, "was a ghost I created to see if you had a soul left to save. You didn't just fail the test, Vanessa. You turned it into a confession." I signaled to the back of the room. My attorney, a man who had been my primary counsel since the days I was negotiating contracts with major studios, stepped forward. He wasn't alone. Beside him were 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Division, and their presence a sharp, spatial contrast to the cold luxury of the ballroom. "As of 8 p.m. tonight," my attorney announced, his voice booming through the sound system I had reclaimed, "the Vance Family Trust has been officially frozen under a court-ordered injunction. Evidence of forgery, wire fraud, and the unauthorized reallocation of pension funds has been submitted to the district attorney. Furthermore, the life estate agreement for this villa, which was predicated on the continued care and residency of the primary owner, Elena Vance, has been declared null and void due to documented elder abuse and endangerment. The crowd, the influencers, the investors, the sycophants didn't move to help them. They moved away. They pulled back like a receding tide, leaving Julian and Vanessa isolated on a small island of their own making. This was the clash in its final brutal form. "You're kicking us out?" Julian asked, his voice hollow. "In front of everyone? This is our home." "No, Julian," I said. walking down from the dais until I was inches from him. I didn't see a man. I saw the ghost of the boy I had sold my blood for, and I realized that by always being his safety net, I had never allowed him to grow a spine. You've forgotten who built this empire. This home was built on my labor, my talent, and my sacrifice. You and Vanessa were merely guests who forgot to say thank you. Vanessa tried to lung at me, her fingers curled like claws, but the officers were faster. They caught her by the arms, the materialistic silk of her sleeves bunching under their gloved hands. "You can't do this," she screamed as she was led toward the exit. "I am Vanessa Vance, and I am a brand. I am the future." "No, Vanessa," I said, watching her go. "You're a special effect that failed to land, and the audience is bored." Julian followed her, his head down, his shoulders slumped in the posture of a man who had finally realized that the delusions of power he'd lived in were made of nothing but smoke and mirrors. As the doors of the grand ballroom closed behind them, the pacing of the room shifted. The influencers began to whisper, their phones already buzzing with the news of the Vance beauty collapse. I didn't care about them. I walked over to the VIP table, picked up a clean linen napkin, and wiped the last smudge of Lady Moretti's adhesive from my temple. The house of cards had fallen. The villa was quiet again, save for the rhythmic, distant hum of the ocean. I felt a consequence in freedom, so profound it felt like I was breathing for the first time in 3 years. We spend so much energy worrying about the wrinkles on our faces, but we ignore the rot in our foundations. We think that by surrounding ourselves with cold luxury and digital masks, we can hide the truth of who we are. But the universe is a master of continuity. If you treat the people who loved you as obsolete, you will eventually find yourself in a world where you are the only thing left that nobody wants. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. And tonight, the only thing I'm wearing is the truth. I looked around the room at the orchids and the crystal, and for the first time, I didn't see a brand. I saw a house, my house. And tomorrow, and I was going to open all the windows and let the chemical scent of their lies blow out into the sea. The witch was done. The artist was home. I reached for the edge of my jawline, the medical-grade adhesive resisting for one final stubborn second before surrendering to the truth. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer the polite hush of an audience. It was the suffocating vacuum of a world, realizing its goddess was a ghost. 300 of the most materialistic influencers and investors in the city stood frozen, their smartphones held aloft like glowing tombstones, recording the precise moment Vanessa's empire of vanity turned to ash. With a slow, rhythmic deliberation, the kind of pacing I had perfected over 40 years of revealing monsters on the silver screen, I peeled away the sharp, regal chin of Lady Beatrice Moretti. The sound was a soft, visceral hiss, a sound like a secret escaping a tomb. I saw Vanessa's eyes widen, her eternal glow foundation cracking under the sheer, tectonic force of her horror. She didn't just stumble, she seemed to shrink, her delusions of power evaporating into the climate-controlled air. I pulled back the architectural silver-white wig, letting my own gray hair spill out, damp and defiant. I plucked the glacial blue contact lenses from my eyes, revealing the steady brown gaze of the woman who had sold her blood to buy this house. So this is how you repay me, Vanessa, I asked. My voice wasn't the European alto of a billionaire anymore. It was the firm, decisive resonance of the mother-in-law she had called a witch just 6 hours prior. By planning my eviction while you sipped champagne paid for by my pension. Vanessa didn't answer. She couldn't. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her silk gown billowing around her like a discarded parachute. The humiliation was so absolute, it was almost physical. She looked at the cameras, the very cameras she had invited to document her triumph, and saw them feeding on her shame. Every influencer who had flattered her a moment ago was now live streaming her destruction. Mom, Julian's voice was a pathetic, hollow vibration from the edge of the stage. He looked at the discarded silicone face lying on the glass dais, the literal mask of his greed, and his knees finally gave out. I may be old, Julian, I said, looking down at the son I had shielded for too long. But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire. You thought the wrinkled woman in the laundry room was obsolete. And you forgot that an SFX artist's greatest skill isn't making things look pretty. It's making the lie so perfect that you never see the trap until it snaps shut. I looked at my attorney, who stood at the back of the room with the local sheriff. The legal truth was a heavy stack of papers in his hand. As of this moment, I announced, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, the trust is dissolved. The forgery has been reported. This house, the brand, and the very air you're breathing, Vanessa, belongs to the witch you tried to bury. You can't do this, Vanessa finally shrieked, her voice a jagged, ugly frequency. I am a brand. I have followers. You have 10 minutes to gather what you brought into this house, I interrupted, my voice as cold as the Pacific mist. Which, if I recall, was a suitcase full of empty promises and a very loud mouth. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on. It was the stage I built for your exit. The spatial contrast was finally complete. I watched the security detail, the men I had actually hired, escort them toward the servants' entrance they had tried to force me to use. Vanessa was shoeless, her designer gown dragging in the dirt of the driveway, her materialistic dreams shattered into a million unedited pixels. An hour later, the villa was silent. The influencers had fled like rats from a sinking ship, taking their ring lights and their fake smiles with them. I walked through the cold luxury of the ballroom, past the marble and the glass, and went straight to my studio, the modest, warm, memory-filled room where the smell of spirit gum and clay felt like a hug. I sat in my old wooden chair and looked into the mirror. I didn't see Beatrice Moretti. I didn't see a witch. I saw a woman whose skin was a roadmap of every war she had won. We spend our lives terrified of the wrinkles, believing the world only has room for the after picture. We layer ourselves in silicone and filters, trying to hide the genetic failure of our humanity. But truth is the ultimate SFX artist. You can paint a masterpiece of lies. You can build a cathedral of glass, but eventually the lighting will change. And when the mask finally slips, the only thing that will keep you standing is the quality of the soul you tried so hard to hide. I picked up a sponge and began to wipe away the last of the adhesive from my temple. It stung, but it was a clean, honest sting. I was no longer a stranger in the mirror. I was the architect of my own freedom. And for the first time in 66 years, the only face I had to wear was my own. The premiere was over. The dignity rise was complete. And as I turned off the studio lights, I realized that the most beautiful thing I had ever created wasn't a monster or a queen. It was the woman who had the courage to finally show her true face.